Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we'll be heading back to New Zealand for more history on Seacliff Mental Hospital. I got a lot of positive feedback from locals in the area, so thank you. I guess I will keep on going with the story. For this episode, I'll be relying heavily on the book The History of Seacliff by Frank Tod and the anthology Unfortunate Folk, Essays on Mental Health Treatment, 1863 to 1992, edited by Barbara Brookes and Jane Thomson. Trigger warnings for this episode include mention of racism, classism, and eugenics. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Seacliff Lunatic Asylum. We left off last week in 1888 when architect Robert Lawson fled to Melbourne after the partial collapse of the asylum's north wing, and Superintendent Dr. Radford King left Seacliff for health reasons. You can probably imagine that whoever was going to take over the asylum had an arduous task ahead of them. The place was essentially left in disarray, structurally speaking, and care of the patients was somewhat disorganized. And yet, applications for the new medical superintendent kept rolling right in. There was fierce competition for who would take over the largest and most expensive asylum in the country. After careful consideration, Dr. Frederick Truby King, who went by his middle name Truby, was selected as the newest medical superintendent at Seacliff. He initially agreed to stay on for 2 years. Dr. Truby King was known to be a blunt man who'd tell it like it is. He was that nerdy kid in elementary school who complained that other students played too many sports and weren't taking their studies seriously. So his parents hired a tutor to help him excel in his studies, and this ended up paying off. Dr. King would end up studying medicine at prestigious schools in Edinburgh and Paris. He was particularly interested in hysteria in women and studying the lunatic mind. In 1887, the newly married Dr. King returned to New Zealand and secured his first appointment as medical superintendent of Wellington District Hospital, where it is said he, quote, reduced the incidence of infection by making improvements in building design, end quote. I'm not exactly sure what improvements he made, but if I had to venture a guess, I'd say he was improving ventilation and isolating wards with more contagious patients. At least that's what most asylums around this time were doing. If there had been such a thing as a 40 under 40 list back in 1889, Dr. King probably would have been on it. He was appointed medical superintendent at Seacliff at age 31, in addition to his appointment as lecturer in mental diseases and examiner in public health and medical jurisprudence at the University of Otago. His first task at the asylum was to start finding ways to cut costs. He centralized cooking into one kitchen, which ended up saving the cost of 2 salaries, or £120 per year. The cost saving is great, but it also sounds like it cost 2 people their jobs. He reduced the amount of meat allowed for each patient and increased the amount of vegetables served daily. Prior to Dr. King's arrival at Seacliff, patients were fed meat 3 times per day, so reducing it to once per day at lunchtime would also end up saving more money for the asylum. Not only that, he believed too much meat was unsuitable for the insane, saying, quote, the consumption of flesh by the insane should be limited because it is desirable to lessen rather than to foster the animal propensities, end quote. King believed that his diet would be more satisfying than the previous one and would induce tranquility of the mind. Although he would be accused later in 1891 of starving patients, Dr. King successfully defended his meal plan and would go on to be well known for his study of nutrition. More on that later. His next task was to make the grounds around Seacliff look better. Like Dr. Kirkbride in the U.S. and other hospitalists around the world, Dr. King believed the environment around the hospital was key to promoting good mental health. And the grounds around Seacliff in 1889 looked anything but manicured and inviting. Farming and gardening became hobbies for the new superintendent, and he quickly began implementing those hobbies into his work. Frank Tod tells this story that not only highlights Dr. King's love of gardening, but also his get-her-done sort of personality. Quote, as well as beautifying the hospital grounds, Dr. King planted a number of shrubs near the Seacliff railway station. One day, while he was inspecting the shrubbery, he observed a painter busy at work repainting the railway water tank in the usual drab color that railway buildings were frequently painted. I'm king of Seacliff, he said to the painter. Your selection of color is far too drab for this district. The painter, apparently thinking that he was speaking to a deluded patient, replied, I don't care if you're the king of Timbuktu, but this color is here to stay. A few weeks later, the painter was seen repainting the tank in a much brighter color. Dr. King had taken up the matter with higher authorities. In fact, Dr. King's scheme for beautifying railway stations extended far beyond Seacliff. It was soon found that those railway stations at which the new arrivals alighted for each of the 4 main mental hospitals were repainted and the surroundings made to look much brighter. End quote. Farming, as well as plant and animal husbandry, became topics on which he would publish pamphlets. Of course, you would have to publish pamphlets. He's clearly someone who cannot stop working. Oh, and just an aside, someone who only identified themselves as MLW, one who knew him well, said that Dr. King often walked the 5 miles to and from work every day. I don't know where this man found time to do anything. He also wanted to spruce up the inside of the asylum to make it look more homey and less asylum-y. Patients were given jobs like painting. Quote, as far as possible, historian Cheryl Caldwell writes, each corridor and room was painted a different color. This contrasted with the somber green and strong blue that had predominated when King took over. The wards were also decorated with plants and flowers and paintings, many of which were donated by King and his wife Isabella. End quote. According to Barbara Brookes, Dr. King also designed a sewerage system and a number of buildings. He ordered supplies, hounded relatives for payment, trained attendants, lectured medical students, and treated the inmates. He wanted the remote asylum to be as self-sufficient as much as was possible. Dr. King believed in keeping patients busy working at the asylum. He said, quote, nothing tends to aggravate mental troubles more than idleness, end quote. And I agree with that. I've seen boredom worsen symptoms all on its own. He expanded working options in order to improve the asylum farm and save money. The trade-off, of course, was that by using unpaid patient labor, they'd be able to save costs on buying food from outside vendors. If you've been listening to the show for even a short while, you know my feelings on free patient labor. Whereas patients before King's arrival were tasked with clearing brush, there were more jobs available into his tenure. Bush clearing remained an option, but others were added, like wood chopping, carrying, digging, planting, mowing lawns, pruning trees, and dairy work, in addition to the workshops. Patients worked no more than 5 or 6 hours a day and were given 2 breaks. Of course, this was all applicable to the male patients. Women were not considered fit for outdoor work, so they were tasked with sewing, knitting, or working in the laundry or kitchen. This would also effectively separate genders from mixing and fraternizing. When patients weren't working, they were encouraged to engage in various recreational and entertainment activities. According to Cheryl Caldwell, quote, these included Saturday afternoon sports, croquet for women on all fine mornings, tennis for special patients, 2 courts were available, a general picnic in summer, fortnightly dances during winter, magic lantern shows, and entertainments provided by visiting companies from Dunedin or given by staff members. A popular favorite was music supplied by a band made up of staff members, and King vigorously defended the expense of setting up this band. Other indoor recreation facilities included a billiard room, a games room, and a reading room. One of the sitting rooms was used as a library and was popular with both patients and staff, end quote. Now it's this next part that really blows my mind. Quote, patients also had access to King's summer cottage in Caritane and, quote, recoverables sometimes spent 2 or 3 weeks there with nurses, end quote. Now, this is incredible for a couple of reasons. One, that the superintendent would allow patients to stay at his home, even if it were a second home. And two, that he was already promoting a sort of group home situation in the early 1890s. That's really progressive. Now, something else that was notable was that Dr. King was the first person to begin photographing patients. On the cover of the anthology, Unfortunate Folk, is a sort of well-known image of one of the first patients Dr. King photographed. I'll post her picture on Instagram and Facebook so you can see. In her work, Women in Madness, Barbara Brookes references this woman whose picture was taken in 1890, the year after Dr. King became superintendent. She's a 44-year-old woman, and she's documented as saying, "I suppose you want a picture of a mad woman. I better stick some straws in my hair and make faces." And I appreciate this quote because many people think they have an idea of what insane people, quote, look like, even today. But the truth is that mental illness affects a lot of people, including very successful people. So this poor gal thought she had to show up as an insane trope. Part of the reason why Dr. King wanted to photograph the patients was to begin to classify them. He tasked himself with separating patients according to the types of illness and severity of their illness and treating them accordingly. I haven't mentioned it yet, but throughout all of these improvements, new admissions just kept arriving at the asylum, and soon overcrowding became a noticeable problem. Dr. King was worried that having so many patients would preclude him from being able to separate patients and treat them effectively, so he continued appealing to the government for additional funds to add to the asylum. Eventually, his efforts were successful. In 1893, according to Cheryl Caldwell, quote, 10 new single rooms were completed for the accommodation of special cases. By 1894, changes were made which allowed for an increased surveillance of both suicidal and epileptic cases. Attempts were made to separate convalescent patients and give them more liberty, and by 1899, a female convalescent cottage was being successfully used, end quote. But the most important classifications he made were people with alcohol addiction and epilepsy. Since treatment for these patients would look differently than treatment for others, it was important that they were separated in order to get the treatment that would best suit them. Eventually, both groups would get their own facilities in different areas around Otago. Now, as you can probably tell by this point, Dr. King had stayed a little longer than his intended 2-year service. He was devoted to the asylum and to the community by this point. His plans were to stay indefinitely, all while he was taking on other roles at the university. By the mid-1890s, overcrowding continued to be the focus of his work. Dr. King noticed a disproportionate number of older folks coming to the asylum. In his 1894 annual report, the Inspector General of Insane Asylums, Dr. McGregor, wrote the following, quote, "There has arisen a strong tendency to throw every case that can be brought within the definition of insanity off the local rates onto the general taxation of the colony. The officers of the charitable aid boards and hospital trustees, especially in the larger centers, are constantly getting medical certificates which enable them to commit to our asylums persons who are suffering from senile decay. Being troublesome and often dirty in their habits and difficult to manage, those in charge make every effort to get them removed," end quote. And this is heartbreaking to read in retrospect. I have to remind myself that there was so much they didn't know at this time about aging or dementias or, what's even challenging today, older people who also have psychotic symptoms. They require so much care and attention, and when the facility didn't have adequate space or staff to care for them, Of course, they would end up dirty and troublesome, most likely because of neglect rather than any intentional fault of their own. And I always like to remind myself that these asylums in the early days were so understaffed and there weren't yet systemized forms of treating patients. I genuinely believe that staff were probably doing their best and were probably there for the right reasons, but it had to be extremely overwhelming with so many patients and so few resources available. I hope these patients weren't intentionally neglected, I guess is what I mean to say. Several years earlier, in 1891, a law had been passed in an attempt to mitigate overcrowding at the asylums. It declared that dormitories must have 600 cubic feet of space per patient. So that turns out to be roughly 6 feet wide by 10 feet long and 10 feet tall. It's not a lot of space, but it's enough. And when they calculated the space at Seacliff versus the number of patients residing there were 142 more patients than the space allowed, given the new law. So they started moving patients to makeshift dormitories in the entertainment halls. The death rate went up from 4.3% from 1890 to 1894, and then jumped up to 5.8% in 1895. When that happened, Dr. King blamed the increase in the patient population. An epidemic of septic pneumonia broke out in 1897, leading to 10 deaths. Once again, Dr. King recognized the impact that overcrowding had on these deaths. It must have been awful to be pleading for additional funding, not getting it, and feeling helpless to stop the increased fatalities. Again, with that many patients and so few staff, cleaning at the asylum had to be nonstop, I imagine. The floors were wooden, so you can imagine with patients soiling themselves and making messes, the wood was constantly damp and the smell had to be horrific. In an attempt to manage the problem, the floors were polished with beeswax and turpentine to make them more water resistant. And when I read that, I actually gasped. Beeswax and turpentine are both flammable. So their attempts to reduce one problem actually significantly increased another more deadly problem. So I genuinely hope they didn't know that those materials were combustible. Otherwise, they were knowingly endangering their patients. In 1898, there were 569 total patients at Seacliff in a space only equipped for 316. Dr. King continued doing his best to mitigate the problem and get the asylum closer to the legal limit. By 1901, the margin had improved slightly. There were only 70 patients over the legal limit. And by 1905, the 600 cubic feet requirement was finally met for the first time. And this is likely because of other changes that Dr. King had made in the previous years. He had no doubt been studying what asylums were doing in Europe and in the U.S. It was around the turn of the 20th century that folks were stepping away from asylums as large institutions and moving toward what they called the cottage style in England. This was a series of smaller buildings on a compound. That way, different types of patients could be treated more effectively. Tuberculosis patients, for instance, could be isolated from other healthy patients, and men and women could be effectively kept from one another. In New Zealand, Dr. King coined this type of architecture the villa style. He probably got too much credit for what seems to me to be like a carbon copy of what people were already doing. But he changed the name, called it good, and people were wowed at his brilliance. Now, yeah, I'm being a bit sassy here, but by all accounts, Dr. King seemed to take credit for himself on this when really it wasn't anything new. They'd been doing it in England for a long while. He was just the first to bring a rebranded version of it to New Zealand. Life changed for Truby King in 1904 when he and his wife adopted a baby girl whom they named Mary. Isabella King was not satisfied with their daughter's development, so she asked her husband to design a better feeding formula for her. He clearly put all his effort into making what he deemed to be the most nutritious formula for her. His earlier interest at the asylum of redesigning the patients' diets came in handy. Pretty soon, Dr. King was putting more time and effort into studying proper feeding and care of infants than he was into his patients at the asylum. He believed, quote, mental diseases were the result of maltreatment in infancy, especially in regard to diet, end quote. So he likely saw his work with infants as being a preventative measure, essentially ensuring that there would be fewer psychiatric needs in the future. According to Barbara Brookes, quote, he trained one of the Seacliff nurses in infant feeding, paid her himself, and sent her into Dunedin to give advice to mothers, end quote. Now, I question this plan. I mean, even though it sounds like he had really good intentions. But remember that the asylum is understaffed and overpopulated, so sending one of their trained nurses to the community to talk about his childcare theories seems a bit problematic. Unfortunately, this isn't the end of Truby King's problematic beliefs. And I want to be balanced as I go about this. Whenever we're talking about prominent figures in history, there's likely to be good things to remember and to praise about them, as well as problematic areas that we now know to be detrimental. Truby King was working with what I assume were good intentions and using the best of the medical and scientific knowledge they had at the time, but he quickly veered into racist and classist ideologies before devoting himself to eugenics. He spent the early years of the 20th century refining his theories on child nutrition and parenting in hopes of reducing the infant mortality rate in New Zealand. This is explained at length by Frank Tod. Quote, about 1905, Dr. King's attention became focused on the harm being done by the almost universal practice of artificial feeding of infants and the ignorance and carelessness of patients in regard to this matter, leading to a very high death rate among artificially fed babies, and the appalling and preventable wastage of human life directly traceable to faulty nutrition in infancy. Before the annual Congress of the New Zealand Farmers Union at Wellington in 1905, a conference over which the governor, Lord Plunkett, resided, Dr. King spoke on the feeding of plants and animals, and he concluded his remarks with a reference to the feeding of children. Civilization is tending everywhere to undermine humanity, and as I have said elsewhere, we have no reason to be proud of the fact that apart from dairy calves, which we treat rather worse than our own offspring, there is no creature in the world so ignorantly and cruelly nurtured as the average infant. In this colony alone, a generally diffused knowledge and recognition of infant requirements and maternal duties would save to the community at least one life a day and would correspondingly increase the strength and vitality of the rest of the rising generation. Statistics reveal the appalling fact that with artificial rearing, infant mortality may be as high as from 5 to 30 times the death rate of children nourished by their mothers. Yet careless bottle feeding is still resorted to by the majority of women. End quote. Frank Tod goes on to say that Dr. King was struck by the fact that out of 25,000 children born annually in New Zealand, about 2,000 died each year. For the next 2 years, Dr. King spent more time focusing on his work with infants and children than he did at the hospital. And by the way, it was during this time that he was furiously working on his research that the hospital changed its name from Seacliff Lunatic Asylum to Seacliff Insane Asylum. On May 14, 1907, Truby King attended a town hall meeting in Dunedin and explained that he wanted to do something with all the work he had been doing with Nurse McKinnon from Seacliff. As Frank Tod explains, quote, he impressed upon those present that in forming a society to take up his work and to organize and extend it, the members must be in earnest. It was decided to form a society, and at a further meeting held on May 23rd of the same year, the first committee was appointed. Thus came into being the Society for the Promotion of the Health of Women and Children, the Plunkett Society, later to be known as the Royal New Zealand Society for the Health of Women and Children. End quote. The Plunkett Society, as it was originally known, was named after Lady Victoria Plunkett, wife of the governor. According to Barbara Brookes, quote, "It aimed to inculcate a lofty view of the responsibilities of maternity, promote breastfeeding, train nurses in maternal and infant welfare, and educate patients in domestic hygiene," end quote. Dr. King started by taking infants into his own home to show how they could be fed and cared for properly. He later offered up his country home in Caritane for 13 babies to receive treatment. Each of the 13 infants flourished under their care. So after the 6-month trial period was up, a home was established in Dunedin that would serve as a dietetic hospital for infants as well as a training school, end quote. It was Truby King's belief that, quote, "the race marches forward on the feet of little children," end quote. And let's be clear, he's talking about European descendants, not Maori, not anyone else. And not everything that Dr. King taught about raising children was great. He was really into giving infants orange juice. That seems odd to me. He wasn't a fan of showing too much affection toward children, so hugging wasn't encouraged. Of course, he was a big proponent of eugenics, so anyone he viewed as defective, he believed shouldn't reproduce. That included children born out of wedlock, alcoholics, homosexuals, anyone with a low IQ, anyone from a different race, and anyone with incurable diseases, to name just a few. So while, yes, Dr. King was successful in lowering the infant mortality rate in New Zealand, he did some not so great things too. And it could be argued that the mortality rate decreased less because of his practices and more because parents learned more about hygiene and how to take care of their children. But who knows? What's interesting in reading about the history of Seacliff is that in just about every source I read, there's a hole in the history of the asylum from about 1895 to 1910, while Dr. King's work with women and children is emphasized. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do wonder how the asylum fared during those years while his attention was diverted elsewhere. Did patients get adequate treatment and care? Did other areas suffer as a result of him working in an adjacent field? I wonder how staff felt about it. I don't have all the answers, but I do know from one source that the instances of restraint use went up during this time. According to Caroline Hubbard, there was a considerable increase in the number of patients being subjected to some form of restraint or seclusion between 1900 and 1910. In 1900, 4.2% of the total patient population experienced restraints or seclusion of some kind. By 1910, it had risen to 11.5. So something was going awry there. It could be partially the result of overcrowding, but I have to wonder if not having Dr. King around very often could have also caused that dramatic increase. So what was happening at Seacliff starting around 1905? There were 736 patients and 141 new admissions, for one. Over half of the patients were over age 50. Patients continued to work around the grounds of the hospital. In fact, about 3/4 of the patients held jobs, and this remained steady. There was a new process for admissions where Dr. King would assess them and determine before they even came to the main building whether they should be on a ward or in a special cottage. He also believed in admitting voluntary cases, seeing it as a sort of preventative measure before the illness really caught on and went past the point of no return. There was a split of opinions about this. On the one hand, Dr. King believed that early intervention at an asylum would prevent escalation of the disease. On the other hand, other practitioners believed that most people should stay out of asylums entirely, preferring a home treatment remedy instead. It's hard to say who had better outcomes among their patients. What I can say is that many people who ended up as patients at Seacliff were ostracized by their families. Being at the asylum was a source of shame. But what's worse is that very few patients received visits from family members or even mail from their loved ones. Dr. McGregor, the Inspector General of Insane Asylums, noted that, quote, "friends only became interested in patients when it was likely that they were going to be moved." There appear to be pitifully few letters to Seacliff inmates, end quote. Staff were being trained so there would be consistency around patient care. Dr. King offered lectures in anatomy, physiology, and general nursing, basically continuing education courses, and attendance was mandatory. By 1907, examinations for all nursing staff were required. They consisted of a written paper, an oral component, and a practical exam. The first round of testing was only open to those who had worked with the insane for at least 3 years. These nursing exams were available annually. The benefit of this, of course, was that the asylum had more highly trained and competent staff. In 1911, the Mental Defectives Act was passed. This entailed that the term lunatic would be replaced by mentally ill or mentally defective. Lunatics became known as inmates, and the asylum's name changed once again to Seacliff Mental Hospital. Patients were now able to admit themselves voluntarily to the hospital. The act also removed alcoholics as a specific category of the insane unless they were proven unable to manage their own affairs. These changes in the nomenclature showed that physicians and lawmakers were finally starting to progress in their understanding of mental illness and the stigma surrounding it. Yet the general public remained woefully unaware. As Caroline Hubbard says, quote, "Lunacy was not a problem of great public concern. In general, it appears that pity, ignorance, and shame dominated the public's feeling toward lunatics throughout this period," end quote. And there were constant staffing shortages during this time. In 1912, there was a nationwide shortage of nursing staff. According to Susan Fennell, this problem became, quote, "so acute at Seacliff that Dr. Truby King wrote a series of letters to the Inspector General leading to recruitment from England." The First World War brought more problems. In 1915, the Inspector General noted that 11.7% of male staff at New Zealand's mental hospitals were at the front or in training. Their places were taken by probationers, but difficulties in obtaining single men meant waiving a restriction against married staff. Staff were previously allowed to marry only after 2 years' service. A nurse who worked at Seacliff during the war remembers many married women being brought in from the local community to fill vacant spots. By 1916, almost all male attendants at Seacliff were married, and 25 lived outside the hospital, end quote. This is pretty incredible and a little disturbing to think about. I mean, imagine being so short-staffed that you begin recruiting random people from the community who haven't even been through training. I think of my hospital and others like it that have really suffered with staffing shortages since the COVID-19 pandemic. At times we felt desperate for staff, but we'd never be able to, get some randos from the community to help out without proper training. That would cause more than a few potential problems. After World War I, the hospital experienced another unexpected and tragic setback, the influenza pandemic of 1918. At one point, out of 80 nurses, only 18 were on duty. There were 22 patient deaths from influenza. Notably, as other mental hospitals around the world began noticing, veterans of the Great War were coming back with strange psychiatric symptoms. Susan Fennell points out that, quote, "shell shock was often manifested as a form of conversion hysteria, producing functional disability of limbs or senses. Doctors at the front or on transport ships came into close contact with cases of neurosis in a way that was spectacularly new to the unspecialized, although not to those experienced in mental hospital work. It was rapidly realized that war neuroses differed from those of civilian only in degree," end quote. Fennell goes on to say that 334 soldiers returned to New Zealand suffering from mental illness. Of those, 199 were sent to mental hospitals, of which Seacliff took a majority. They were treated separately from other patients since their symptoms required a different type of treatment, namely hypnosis, psychoanalysis, and sympathetic listening. I'm actually pretty impressed with that list. We still use many of those techniques today with vets and with others experiencing trauma. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening, Truby King was still working on his Mothers and Children's Society, traveling around the world promoting infant welfare, offering trainings, and yes, of course, even writing a book. Oh, and in 1917, he was awarded the CMG, or Clinica Medica General, for over 35 years of practice in the field. I imagine at some point it became too much, even for a workaholic like Dr. King. And after 31 years as superintendent of Seacliff Mental Hospital, Dr. Truby King stepped down from his position. He had made so many positive changes to the hospital, especially in the early years, but he seemed to recognize the need to move on and focus his attention on his true passion. And that's where I'm going to pause the history of Seacliff this week. There is so much more that I could have said about Truby King. His story will continue in the next episode, although it's more of an update or follow-up than about being connected to the hospital. Next week, we'll pick up in 1921, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we will make it to the end of the hospital's history. So stay tuned. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you didn't see on the other Facebook or Instagram pages, my Patreon is up and working. Huzzah! So for now, I just have one audio clip posted, but I will get some more up soon. It's a series of strange newspaper articles from like 1929 and around that time period. It's really interesting to see what passed for news back in the day. I've also started a deal where if you donate $5 a month for at least 3 months, you can choose a hospital or sanitarium for me to talk about in a mini episode on Patreon. And that'll be your special episode outside of our regular episodes. So if there's anything else that you'd like to see as Patreon content, let me know at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. I also have an Ask Me Almost Anything section. If there's anything you want to know about my job as a psychologist, about state hospitals within HIPAA guidelines, of course, about the podcast or about anything I've covered on the podcast, let me know. Again, that's behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. And as always, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening, but super extra bonus points if that's on Apple Podcasts. In fact, you should go do that right now. I'll wait. Just kidding. I won't wait. I would love it if you rated and reviewed. Thank you this week to Michelle for their review on CastBox. Thank you for listening. And again, thank you to Sue M for help with sources and Jay for cultural and historical assistance. I could not do it without you. And most of all, thanks to you for listening. You may not feel like your one little listen is important, but it really, really, really is. It means the world to me. And don't even get me started on how excited I get when someone refers a friend or family member to the show. That's just the best. So thank you. Please come back next week. But as always, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.